Got to look to him for approval.
What?
Okay.
You ready to go?
Yeah.
Where is the little boy?
That'll be here later. Tonight, we're going to tread on some new dangerous ground. Not that we haven't been treading on ground that, very few dare to tread. But nevertheless, I think we will be discussing an area this evening in which really no one should discuss. In other words, it's something that's there. We accept it, and best that these aspects that we will discuss this evening be left alone. In the weekly portion that was read on Shabbat, we had the discussion of Yom Kippur, in which the opening sentence, which is in Leviticus chapter 16, where it says, "And the Lord spoke unto Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron, when they drew near before the Lord and died." And as many of you know, maybe many of you don't know, and certainly those who will be listening to the tapes by and large do not know, and that is that Aaron had four sons. And two of them, Nadav Avihu, mentioned in the portion of the week known as Parshat Shmini, and that is chapter 9. No, it wasn't chapter 9, but yes, it is chapter 9, and where there is a discussion of. It is chapter 10, where there is discussion that the two sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, each of them took some incense, put fire therein, brought it as a sacrifice, and because of that, they died. These two sons died. And the Zohar, as well as the Midrash, and as well as the Talmud, all seem to concur that these two sons of Aaron were very high souls, to the extent that they also could be compared to the level of consciousness of all Israel combined. And then we are told in chapter 10 of Leviticus that these two individuals sinned and brought a fire that was not permitted for the reason that their father was alive, and they had no right to precede their father in preparing these various sacrifices. And there is another commentary, including that of the Zohar, which states that they were drunk. Another commentary for the reason that they died was because they were not married. This is briefly the overview of what happened to the two sons, very high souls, as all agree. And our question naturally would be, how come? How come they performed this kind of a deed? Where were their head trips at the time of this kind of presentation of a sacrifice to the Lord? And I'm not going to be discussing that aspect this evening. However, we need this background to understand that which we will discuss this evening. Along comes Rabbi Isaac Lurie and says that all of these reasons that are given as to why Nadav Avihu, why these two sons of Aaron brought these sacrifices. And the answer of the Ari is that because they were high souls, we must treat them as high souls. And when we say high souls, naturally we are discussing levels of consciousness, levels of understanding, because what is the difference in stages of souls? One aspect, the connection with the broader cosmos of intelligence, a broader understanding, a deeper understanding, and the higher the soul, meaning the greater awareness that has been achieved by an individual, he is then considered to be one of a higher soul. And because these two sons were considered to be on a much higher level than all of Israel, then of course the Ari, Rabbi Isaac Luria, raises the question, how really could they have committed such an act that brought the wrath of the Lord? And they were burnt. They were burnt without any recognition that they were burnt, incidentally. In other words, a fire came down and just consumed their soul. Do you imagine being involved in a fire, being in the midst of a fire, and nothing of any physical material, neither their clothes nor their body, were consumed by this fire? And the Zohar says very clearly that their body remained intact and everything around them remained intact, except the expression that they were burnt by fire means that their soul was removed. And so that's another indication that we are discussing two souls of a very high nature. And therefore, without again going into the details, that would be a session by itself. And some of you have already, through other classes, become aware of what Rabbi Isaac Luria says on this particular subject. But in any event, he said that they did not sin. From where they were coming from, they did not sin. Now this is contrary to the obvious interpretation and translation of the Bible itself. Therefore, we come again to the conclusion, as the Zohar states throughout the Zohar, that it is only a fool that will take the literal translation as a meaning of what is written, or that which is contained in the Torah. To continue with this, I read the Zohar, because that is our connection to all of us achieving a greater awareness, connecting to other aspects of the cosmos. כי כך למדנו, שכתוב אלה שמות בני אהרון הכהנים. These are the names of the children of Aaron, the priests. וכתוב, and it says, in Numbers, incidentally, chapter 3, Habchor, the firstborn, was Nadav, ve'Avihu, Elazar, v'Tamar. And the Zohar asks, ve'Elazar v'Tamar hayat tzarich lomar. It says Nadav and va'Avihu, and obviously, if the Torah is providing us with this information as to the four sons, it should say Nadav and va'Avihu and Elazar and Itamar. That would be the normal way, a normal correct language when the Bible is is telling us or relating to us who the 4 sons were. It should have added a vav. And the Zohar answers, Elashakul haya Avihu kishnei achav. That Avihu was like his 2 brothers, Elazar v'Itamar. Nadav shakul keneged kulam. And Nadav was shakul, he was weighed, meaning his level of neshama, his level of soul, was weighed against all. This particular portion, chapter 17 of the Torah, is read on Yom Kippur. Read on Yom Kippur. The reason it is read on Yom Kippur, again, the Zohar tells us, because man shehasadikim mistalkim min haolam, when righteous people leave this world, mistalkim min haolam hadinim, and dinim, as you already are familiar with, the word dinim is a code word, not only for judgment, but it means the cause and effect without mercy, meaning if someone, as Cosmos 1, and we have discussed this in a previous session, there were 2 cosmos. There was Cosmos 1 and Cosmos 2. Cosmos 1, in other words, were there worlds before our worlds? The answer is yes. There was. And the Zohar says, in the beginning, the Lord thought of creating the world, the universe, with Midat Hadin. What does that mean? That there would be retribution immediately for that which was against the laws and principles of the order of the universe. In other words, if someone stole, his hand would disappear. If someone murdered, he would disappear. In other words, there was the immediate reaction to the action. That is referred to as Midat Hadin. In other words, if something of a negative nature, if there's been negative activity prevailing within the cosmos, immediately the world would suffer the consequences. We have seen catastrophic incidents, not only in our time, but throughout history. Catastrophic occurrences, like the destruction of the temple, which meant not only the destruction of Jewry, but it meant the destruction of the entire world. All nations suffered, the same way as as recent as the Holocaust. It wasn't merely the 6 million Jews that suffered the consequences of a Holocaust or negative human activity, but 20 million other people. So there have been catastrophes in the past, and that is, according to the Zohar, the result of human activity. The result of human activity. Because it is only we humans that dictate dinim. It is only we humans that, based on our activity, whether it be positive activity or negative activity, that is the way the cosmos and the universe appears. If it appears in a catastrophic state, in a holocaustic state, that will be the result. Because everything, every action, and every reaction depends purely and solely on man himself, on mankind. Therefore, dinim, at one time in Cosmos 1, the Creator thought that the world should be created, the universe should be created with Midat Hadin, meaning action and reaction, but immediate reaction. And it says that then the Creator or the Lord saw that this was not a desirable condition for the universe, because the universe could not exist, and he then went on to create what is known today as Cosmos 2, meaning a cosmos with Midat Harachimim, which means time. In other words, if someone steals, his arm would not be immediately removed. It would not become vaporized. If someone murdered, his body would not become vaporized, but he would have time. He would have time to so-called repent. He would have time to repent. He would have time to undo, if it was possible. How can you undo if you murder? But and we won't go into that because that's already discussed in on Rosh Hashanah, the tapes of Rosh Hashanah, where we can undo things, because on another level.
That was another level.
On another level. Okay. Yeah. So it maybe for you, if Yaakov came in late. Okay, we'll try to pick up from our interruption, although we were discussing how Nadav Avihu became consumed with a flame, and like Moshe, when he observed the burning bush, if you recall, but the bush did not become consumed. Here the Zohar says the same thing about Nadav ve'Avihu, that they were not consumed. To the extent that we will shortly be reading in the Zohar, where these two souls ultimately became incarnated, and that was Pinchas. But getting back to the point of Dinim, we were discussing Cosmos 1 and Cosmos 2. When the Creator observed in the future, reflecting the future, that with Midat Hadin, meaning immediate retribution, an immediate connection between positive and negative. In other words, if there was human negative activity, there was an immediate consequence of negativity. There was immediate suffering, the price that had to be paid for that human negative activity. And vice versa, if there was positive activity, you wouldn't have to wait until Olam Haba, until after death. Immediately the rewards were equivalent and were reconcilable with the positive activity. And when he saw that this was not a situation by which the world could exist, he created Cosmos 2. Cosmos 2 meant time. The aspect of time as we know it today was created in Cosmos 2. Cosmos 2 dictated that man would have an opportunity to alter the laws of cause and effect. In other words, if he stole, his hand would not immediately be vaporized, but rather he could put a hold on it, say, for stealing or for murdering, this would be the consequence. He could put a hold on consequences, and that's actually the aspect of time. That is what dinim are all about. Dinim means the immediate consequence without the intervention of time, without the intervention of compassion. What is compassion? Which is also called midat harachimim. In other words, someone who has committed a serious crime comes before the court, comes before the judge, he pleads mercy. Why is he pleading mercy? In other words, the consequences for his activity, the consequences of his deeds should not immediately become manifested with retribution, as retribution deals and is connected with the activity involved. Rachamim. So the Zohar says that when tzaddikim leave this world, they also take along with them this aspect of midat adin. In other words, all human activity which might have become negative, umitatam shel tzaddikim mechaperet al avonot hador. And all the sins, meaning what are sins? All negative activity, which should have brought the effect similar to the activity, in other words, a negative consequence, disappears with the death of tzaddikim. V'alkein Parshat Bnei Aaron, and therefore this Parsha of Bnei Aaron, anu korim b'yom kippurim, shetiyeh kapara lavonot Yisrael. In other words, the reason it is red is not because of the conventional well, I shouldn't say not because, that's not correct, but if you're into what is corruptly called pshat, because that is not pshat. Pshat, as you know, if you don't know what pshat means, it means literal translation. But that's the furthest from the truth, and is a total corruption, because pshat is the highest level from every point of view. Pshat. So if you ever hear somebody telling you, hey, what are you into now? You tell them, oh, I'm into a little Kabbalah. Kabbalah, don't you know? You've got to get into the literal translations of this stuff. And then when you really get up there and you know everything else, and then you can delve into a little of Kabbalah. But it's the other way around, because pshat comes from the word undressed. In other words, everything is so naked, it's so pure. There's no any adulteration that accompanies commentaries and so forth and so on. So I say on another level, we can understand that the death of tzaddikim, in this case, and they are called tzaddikim incidentally, so you can understand where the Ari is coming from when he says that Nadav and Avihu were tzaddikim. They were righteous people. Although those who are somewhat familiar with the literal translation of chapter 10 in the death of these two sons, the literal translation makes it appear to us as if these were two really culprits of the worst magnitude coming and performing the service when their father was actually appointed, and so forth and so on. So some feel that the reason we read it on Yom Kippur is so that we shall weep a little, and because the two sons died, and so we should weep on Yom Kippur, and if you weep on Yom Kippur, then you could be assured of Teshuvah. But that is not what the Zohar says. Because first of all, to weep on their death, they had made a particular tikkun, they had made a correction according to the Ari. And according to the Zohar, the reason we do read this Parsha on Yom Kippur, because that is going to assist us in the removal of our negative activity. That should bring the consequence of dinim, of judgment, meaning no compassion. Why? Why would their death, in essence, bring about kapara, atonement? What's the connection? Because they died, but in any event, we now have somewhat of a logical reason why we read this particular portion on Yom Kippur, because we, in effect, are looking for atonement at one minute with the light. In other words, we want to restore, again, the level of consciousness that can permit us to see through the maze of stuff that goes through our daily lives, rather than be consumed by what is known in Kabbalistic terminology as klipot. The reason we don't see as well as we should see, the reason we do not understand as well as we should understand, and the reason we're so flooded with psychiatric decisions on how much of a percentage do our minds really grasp, whether it's 5% or 8%. And of course not 92%, because that 92% is something that we have absolutely no control. Can you imagine how much control we have according to a psychiatrist? When 92% is something totally oblivious to us? We do not accept that. And we say that if we can somehow assure the removal of the klipot, those veils that prevent us from seeing as well as we should with the 92%, or observe with the 92%. So by reading, and if you know what the reading of the Torah is about, and if you're lucky enough, you've got a real kosher one, which is a rare object today, to have a kosher Sefer Torah, so say the rabbis. I'm not really up on all the Sefer Torahs throughout the world, but they say about 90% are not structured properly. So if you're lucky enough to fall into the right place, and you've got the right Sefer Torah, then we know that what, in effect, the reading of the Torah is making the connection. and where you can travel back in time, according to the Zohar. This is the only reason why there is a reading, whether it's on Shabbat or whether it's on Yom Kippur, or for that matter, any time that the Torah is read. And it must be such a very heavy scene that some people seem to find it difficult to deal with it, because in most synagogues, from my understanding and observation, that's really the time you discuss real estate, stock markets, and other matters. So maybe it's really too heavy for them to handle, because it is a heavy scene. We're traveling back in time. We're traveling back in time to the energy that this particular portion is displaying, is providing us with. If we could connect with that information, and one of the surest ways of traveling back in time to connect with this particular section 16 in the Torah. We read this because if we can connect to this frame of reference called Nadav and Avihu, we then have a chance, because they, through their death, states the Zohar, we can kind of wash out, we can erase any of the negative activity that we may have performed throughout the year. What we have established now is a completely different picture, as you might say, a literal translation of this idea of Nadav Avihu presents itself from a literal translation. Certainly this is not the result. We're dealing now with tzaddikim. We're dealing not only with tzaddikim, but we are dealing with two individuals that were so powerful that they could provide for us atonement. How bad could they have been? So what we have done is absolutely destroyed any idea from the point of view of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who, as I've always claimed, has impeccable credentials. And therefore, we connect with these two people to receive the proper atonement. Now, why should their death represent kapara, represent atonement, at-one-ment? But I've kind of answered it when I gave you the Zohar's clue, and that's when the lights blew.
Careful.
Maybe I shouldn't repeat it again, Sylvia, right?
Try it.
3
times.
Okay. All right, we'll try it again. That their bodies were not consumed. In fact, nothing. Although it says Vatetza Esh, and the fire went out and consumed them, the Zohar tells us very clearly that nothing was consumed. Their soul left. Their soul left to be incarnated in no other person than Pinchas. And we will be discussing that matter of their incarnation into Pinchas. Both of them. Can you imagine? Both of them. Not one, but both of them. What an observation, right? Like as if one of them wasn't enough for Pinchas, he needed one, both. But we will discuss it.
I think the soul as a person is hard to believe, but when you think of souls as qualities and attributes, it's easy to believe.
Well, okay, but in any event, if they are tzaddikim. Now, why did their death represent atonement? We will have to discuss another matter, which again is quite strange, I think, to many people. But again, in this weekly portion, because it's really all connected, if we just lift a couple of veils and we can see how Rabbi Shimon ties in so many various subjects which, for all intents and purposes, do not really relate one to the other. He discusses in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse number 11, I'm sorry. Verse number 11, I'm just going to give you the literal translation. There shall not be found amongst you charmers, one that consulteth a ghost or a familiar spirit, or the dead. Or the dead. Now this is a literal translation. Therefore, if there is amongst you anyone who does not have a father and a mother, I'm certain that you've never gone to the cemetery to pay your respects. It is only at the time when you bury a dear or departed one is when you should really be going, because why does one go to a grave site? To intercede. It says, V'doresh el hametim. You're not permitted to be doresh el hametim, to use the divination of the dead. Now, why would one be going? And is in the same portion, Acharei Mot, Lamad. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Yom Echad Hayaholchim Rabbi Chizki v'Rabbi Yesa b'derech. These two students of Rabbi Shimon were going along the way. Pakshu b'makom shenikar Gush Chalav. Still exists. Vayikra, and there was what it's called, I think the St. John's tree, a carob tree. They call it St. John's. What? Baksa. Okay. Yashvu samoch lebeit hakvarot, and right next to them was a cemetery. V'Rabbi Yesa haya biyado chelek echad shel Sefer Torah shenikra, and by chance he was holding a Sefer Torah that was ripped. Kloma shehai biyodo chelek hanikra miSefer Torah im amud shebetocho, and he had a section. As you know, the Torah is sewn together with many pieces of parchment, and they had one. Ba'od sheyashvu itnaneh lefneim kever echad, and while they were sitting there, one of the plots where someone was buried began to move. V'tza'ak, and it began to yell, or I should say, maybe someone in that kever. Oi, oi, woe, harei ha'olam nimsa b'tza'ah, the world is in desperate straits. Ki haTorah gilta lekan, because the Torah, well, you could translate it several ways, but in any event, the Torah is in galut. And it's yelling, but maybe, because they were referring to maybe this piece of parchment, which would be the literal translation, because they brought the Torah to us. And these two students who are alive have come kind of to make fun of us and to embarrass us. Rav Chizkiah el hakever. And Rabbi Chizkiah spoke to the kever. Now always remember the verse I quoted before. Mi ata? Who are you? Amalo metani. He says, I'm dead. Okay? But in any event, what does he do with that verse, number 11, in Deuteronomy 18? Right? Although I'm dead, I am aroused by the fact of the Sefer Torah. Because once upon a time in the past, the world was also in desperate straits. And the live people came here to arouse us with a Sefer Torah. I and my other compatriots that live here. I remember when we used to go to Rabbi Shimon when our children were very, very small, and we would be praying by the kever of Rabbi Shimon. I would say, well, where is Rabbi Shimon? They used to say, well, he lives here. That's what he's saying. We live here. V'chaveru hikdamnu l'shenei Chevron. And we used to visit those who are sleeping in Hebron. They are called sleeping. And for those of you not familiar with Hebron, we are referring to Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. וכשנתחברו בגן עדן ברוחות הצדיקים, נמסר לפניהם שספר תורה הוא שהביאו לפנינו החיים היה פסול. Coincidentally. That the Sefer Torah that they brought to request Rachamim, because the world was obviously full of dinim, full of negativity, and they brought the Sefer Torah to arouse Rachamim. And what was wrong was what that Sefer Torah was pasul. Umeshakeh b'shem HaMelech al shenimtza vav yitera b'mikra hu de v'shasat shesi pasaot. There was an extra vav. And kevan shikro b'shem HaMelech, and because the Torah, which is only names of the king, of the Lord, lo yashuva eleihem, lo diam im nitkablu apalatam v'dochu oti v'chaverai b'sharhu mibeit hayeshiva. And when we came to ask for rahamim, for mercy on the world, they threw us out. And so, this is, again, you're coming with a piece of the Torah and you're arousing us. So we recall when we were alive and we did the same thing. When we went to Hebron. And this is what the word that came back to us. I mean, look at the conversation. And for those of you familiar with the Zohar, you know that Rav Hamnuna Sava is called the old fish. ואז נתעורר רב אלעזר ברבי שמעון שהיה קבור עמנו והלך והתפלל בגן עדן עליהם. And because Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon was together with them, and they prayed, and the world was cured. And he concludes, Umiyom Mahu, and from that day on, She'alu et Rabbi Elazar me'akever azev shebegush chalav, and you know that Rabbi Elazar is not in Gush Chalav. For those of you who have been to Maron, where Rabbi Shimon is buried, his son Rabbi Elazar is buried together with him in the same mausoleum, where over 100,000 people will be visiting in just 2 nights hence.
I smell it. I smell it. It's faint, but I smell it. I have a very good sniffer.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't get to this side. I'm also.
It's very faint. I can smell it. It smells like burning garbage.
Yeah, really?
You smell it, see?
Well, feel the wires to see if they're hot.
We're getting warm.
No. No. So far, so good.
Smells it too.
You smell it as well?
It's very faint. Yeah, but it's good.
A heavy session tonight. I mean, we do this all the time. Right? Okay, we'll try to keep going. In any event, the Gush Chalav is an area that is close by. It's close by. And what happened was, as we will be reading the story of the Rabbi Shimon Saturday night, that the bed moved from his residence, and the bed went to a certain place, and that's where the bed went down, and that's where they buried Rabbi Shimon. So also the same thing happened. Rabbi Elazar was buried in Gush Chalav, because the story is taking place in Gush Chalav, and they brought him to Miron. And they're saying now, these people in that keva, in that gravesite, are saying, Ein mishi yoreh lakum lefnei yisheni Hebron. There is nobody who can intercede with us to the people of Hebron, meaning Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. And yet, we see here that there is a prohibition. Is that right? A prohibition to consult the dead. You know, there are many people who go into seances, which is what you might say is what the verse is discussing, the aspect of seances. And yet, we are told also in the Ari, in addition to the Zohar, and that beside Caleb, who was one of the 12 spies, the reason that he was successful in returning with a good report and wasn't clouded by the other 10, who subsequently died, is because he went and asked for an intercession of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He went to Hebron, we are told. And by virtue of this, of pleading with these people to intercede for him on his behalf, he survived. So what does it mean here, V'doresh el hametim? And the answer is, now this might upset some people, but nevertheless, we are looking for whatever the truth might be. Arkein lamadno hasadik, af al pi shenifta min ha'olam hazeh, ein mistaleg ve'ein neved mikol ha'olamot. In other words, death is an illusion. Death is an illusion. We also know from the Zohar that Moshe, according to the Zohar, never died. Moshe lo met. But the Bible seems to make it very clear in Deuteronomy, and we discussed this, so you can hear the tape on Zayin Ba'adar, which there's the 7th day of the Hebrew month of Adar, in which we are told Moses passed on into the other world. And it says at the end of Deuteronomy, where the discussion of Moses' death is narrated. What's that? In Deuteronomy, Devarim, right at the end. Right at the end. Vayamat Sham Moshe, this is verse 5 in chapter 34, and Moses died there, Be'eretz Moav, al pi Hashem. And they buried him, Vayikra oto begai Be'eretz Moav. But the verse also says, V'lo yadei ish et kvuroto al hayom hazeh. But no one ever knew where he was buried. Now you understand that, right?
Yes, sure.
In other words, they buried him, begai Be'eretz Moav, and in the same verse, not the verse afterwards, the same verse says that Lo yada ish et kvuroto ad hayom hazeh. Nobody even knows it until this very day. And then it goes on to say a couple other things about Moshe. Moshe ben Me'ah ve'esim shana b'moto, when he died. But I must caution you that the Zohar makes it very clear. In other words, it's not open for interpretation by me or anybody else. It says Moshe lo met. Moses did not die. The fact that, like we discussed last time, the world of illusion, the temple exists. Do you remember? The temple exists. It was never burnt to the ground. It's an illusion that we assume that it no longer is present. It's an illusion. So is death an illusion. By whom? By tzaddikim. By tzaddikim. Meaning that they are present. Moshe lo met, and all tzaddikim are present. In fact, we are told that their body remains intact in the gravesite. It does not become decomposed. And there have been instances where enemies during the Holocaust dug up certain graves of certain righteous people, and they found these bodies intact. because they did not die. But they were dead as an illusion for those who were around them. As it says in the same sentence, that they buried him, but they didn't know how. What do you mean you don't know? You buried him. Why don't you know? How do I know where Jerusalem is today? Children pass on to their parents, to their children, and so forth. And that's the way we know about anything. And so here nobody could know where he was buried. So the Zohar says he did not die because he was a tzaddik. And when you are a tzaddik, the Zohar says, Eino mistalek ve'eino neved mikol ha'olamot. He does not disappear from all the worlds. Ki hu nimtzeh b'chol ha'olamot od yoter mi b'chayav. And here is the secret. In fact, his presence is felt more so after he passes out of this world than while he was alive. His presence is felt more so in all the worlds, yoter mi b'chayav, more than if he was alive. Ki b'chayav haya nimsa ba'olam hazeh bilvad. Because when he is in this corporeal body, when his soul of this tzaddik is imprisoned in this world, the body acts as a klipa, as a separation, as a fragmentation and connection with the rest of all the other worlds. All the worlds. And when we discuss all the worlds, we are discussing different levels of consciousness. The real worlds. And after death, hu nimsa b'gimel olamot, he is found in the three worlds which deal with our world. Therefore, before we return to the question of discussing with Meitim, we kind of have our answer. The word stressed in the Bible is very clear. V'doresh el hameitim. Those people who have died are those that you should not consult. But the tzaddikim did not die. In fact, they are more powerful. Why? Because the body no longer can act even as an illusionary separation from all of the worlds, from the entire cosmos. And therefore we can understand why this portion of the Torah is read on Yom Kippur, because, and I won't repeat again, but if you listen to the tapes of Yom Kippur, when we talk about atonement, we are not discussing on that literal corrupted level of, I'm sorry, now can't you do something for me? Why? Well, isn't God a Lord of mercy? All of a sudden on Yom Kippur he becomes a Lord of mercy. What about the rest of the year? Where's his mercy when we need him all throughout the year with all our troubles? And throughout the centuries? Where is the Rachamim? But all of a sudden this Jew walks into a Bet HaKnesset on Yom Kippur with full expectations, but this is the day that I can absolutely expect Rachamim. You mean God works only one day a year? What about the rest of the year? What about the rest of the centuries? Where is he then? The answer is, Bereshit bara Elokim. Bara is the word of Bria. You must be familiar. There are levels. But the level, what I call the energy store, where the light functions, where the light is like a powerhouse, that whether these lights have gone out, does that mean the power station has ceased to function because in this room it became dark? Only a fool would think that way. In other words, that operates. But I am now disconnected from that power station. So what is Yom Kippur? It is a cosmic event that permits us a direct connection to Bria. And therefore, the tzaddikim, when they die, they become completely and wholly connected with Bina, with the world of Bria. Therefore, They are at that storehouse. They are at the warehouse where energy is distributed. Now, if I can connect with these two sons on Yom Kippur, they are going to assist me because they were tzaddikim. And let us never make that mistake. They are tzaddikim. And they are there on Yom Kippur. Not so I shed a tear, but if I know how to connect with them, then I make that connection directly to the world of Bria through these two sons because they were of such a high level of energy. Therefore, when it says Moshe lo met, the Zohar says Moshe lo met, because it says no one knows where he's buried. Of course no one knows where he's buried, because he was never buried. But it says that they buried him. But we are discussing who buried him. Those people who were to die in the Midbar too. They were dead people. Who buried him? Incidentally, it doesn't say who buried him. But whoever did bury him thought they were burying him. Thought they were burying him. And according to the Zohar, he never died. Therefore, when it says V'doresh et hametim, you're not permitted, why not? What's wrong? What could be bad? Why does it say no? And we already know, and I've said it before, so if I'm to be condemned twice for the same transgression, I accept it. And that is that morals, as expressed in the Torah, is a complete hoax. Complete hoax. In other words, it says, do not steal, doesn't mean that. When it says do not, in the Ten Commandments, do not murder, it doesn't mean that. How do I know it doesn't mean that? Because if for those who have learned that there is free will and determination in this universe, in fact, that is the entire reason for creation, bread of shame, for those familiar with Kabbalistic teachings, because the bread of shame, we must be given the opportunity to decide whether yes or whether no. So if the Torah says no, then I'm not being provided with an opportunity. Why is it saying do not? Furthermore, history has taught us to this very day, no matter how strict an ordinance could be, no matter how serious the consequences can be, like those signs, do not smoke, cancer causing and everything else, nobody has stopped smoking. Or some have, but many have not, despite what is written. Most people in this world, in one way or another, do cheat. And so what are the consequences of the Torah? What is meant by the Ten Commandments? Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill. What does it mean? Is it interfering with my free will? The answer is no. But when we understand the Ten Commandments from a Kabbalistic point of view, then we understand that the purpose of any negative activity does not bring the desired result. In other words, if I steal, I don't get the money. And I won't go into that now because that's discussed in Volume 2. I don't get the money. If I murder, and there is usually a purpose in murder, unless someone is deranged, then that's another section in the law, of Jewish law. It is someone that must be told by two people. Do you know what the consequences? In other words, the laws surrounding murder are so strict as to be certain that this man is not only was in a premeditated state, but he was completely sane. And there must be witnesses to attest to that. To speak to this individual, like you've got to speak to the murderer before he's going to shoot the other fella down. But this is the Gemara. There are strict rules on what constitutes a murderer. The answer is, from a Kabbalistic point of view, it doesn't pay. not because you're not permitted. It doesn't pay. The same way as when it says, do not consult the dead, it is not do what you want. Because the original bread of shame dictates free will. The fact is that people do exercise their free will, despite what is written in the Torah. It is only the tzaddik who understands what the Torah's message is, not from a literal level, but for a deeper understanding. To understand the entire cosmos, to understand what's really happening all over with my act and what's happening to me in my relationship to the entire quanta cosmos. These are clues. These are not laws, but rather information. Information by which we can benefit from that information. But you have to know what the information is about. But suffice to say, that information has nothing to do with the literal translation. Nothing. That was never the intent of the Lord to tell me, do not steal. He commanded me to not steal. But where is free will? You tell me that I can choose. You're already telling me that I have to pay the consequences. I'll suffer the world to come if I commit one of the 365 transgressions. And the answer is, He doesn't punish us. He never will punish us. Isn't He a Lord of Rachamim? I must accept that. He is not a Lord of Rachamim one day of the year. What it means is that He gives us time, because we have free will, to choose 365 days. There is Rachamim. There should have been more of a consequence. What the Torah is teaching us here is what the cosmos is about, how this can benefit me. That when I go to the synagogue on Shabbat and I listen to that reading of the Torah, it is not because of obligation that I'm attending service there. It is what is it going to do for me, and no other reason. What is it going to do for me? Every law, every prohibition, every positive precept is there for only one reason: to assist us in achieving a greater awareness, a greater understanding, so that I will not have to suffer the consequences. I will not put myself into din. That I know how to connect with Rachamim, because Rachamim is here every day of the year. On Yom Kippur, they give us kind of a double feature. An easier way to achieve, because the cosmos are open for that kind of venture. The cosmos, whereas throughout the 364 days of the year, the cosmos work against those individuals who do not know the workings of the cosmos. And the only way you can know the workings of the cosmos is by the Zohar interpretation of everything that is written in the Torah. And we will discuss that shortly when we come to another disaster of the Torah, the story of Tamar and Yehuda. For those of you not familiar, I mean, that's one of the classics that, thank God, when you study, leave it alone. Don't touch it. But we shall touch it this evening. Hopefully the lights will stay on. Okay, we'll have a short break.
Bottom line, you're not supposed to go.
Oh, beautiful.
The dead never. Tzaddikim, yes. What? You got to learn. You better learn.
Why does it have to be like this?
Why is it coded? Oh, we've discussed that a long time ago.
One more quickie. Okay, when it says in the last thing that where Moshe was dead, the Yom HaShem. Okay, but if it's written all the time when Moshe got it, why would it say up to this day?
Isn't it forever?
No,
Very good. Very good. A good question, because it doesn't mean what it says, what literally is translated. We are not going to change the translation, but it means something else. Hi, how are you? Jackie is telling me a lot about it. Okay.
לא,